Okay, so following from Joseph Campbell, we have Northrop Frye. Northrop Frye had some really excellent hair. It's important for you to know that. He's one of the most famous Canadians in sort of the history of academics. I was a professor at the University of Toronto. Before that, he tried to be a church minister, and he's quite well known for a couple of things in the academic world, and one is his archetypal criticism, which we'll look at in more detail, and the other thing is he put a lot of work into recognizing the Bible as the sort of foundational source for literature. Certainly it can be argued that the Bible is a central point of reference for much of Western literature, obviously in the last 2,000 years at least. So that intertextuality is how authors can insert more layers of meaning and layers of thought into a text. So if I as a writer make a reference to Romeo and Juliet in terms of, describing some sort of a romance or something like that, that conveys a lot of meaning without me having to describe it. It's kind of a shorthand, right? So everyone kind of gets what that means, right? Everyone kind of knows that story, and so I can make that general reference to Romeo and Juliet, and it would save me having to write several more paragraphs or possibly pages explaining, this particular romance or whatever. So in a similar way, you can make reference to, we were just talking about the belly of the beast. So Jonah and the whale. Or, the burning bush or whatever. And for most of the last couple of thousand years, it could be expected that most everyone is going to be familiar with that story from the Bible or from Shakespeare, and therefore you've saved yourself a lot of time in explaining something by just kind of comparing it to this common vocabulary that everyone has. Does that kind of make sense? So that's what we call intertextuality, which is a really, really smart sounding word that I encourage you to become comfortable enough with to use on your own. No one will ever question your intelligence again. So intertextuality is something that gets more and more complex the further that we get into history, I guess. So, but even going back to the Alexandrian Greeks in the couple of centuries before Christ, there was a community of highly academic, highly educated writers who would make really smart references to each other's poems or writings, and it's been a sort of a time-honored tradition, but just because it is so effective. And so the ancient Greeks could make reference to Homer and the Iliad or the Odyssey, and some specific aspect of it, the shield of Achilles, for example, and that would indicate something that was incredibly complex or powerful or gifted from the gods or whatever. But just by saying the shield of Achilles, everyone knew what you were talking about, and then you've got that comparison built in. There is a sense that with the changing high school curriculum across North America over the last several decades, that your generation may be losing some of its ability to pick up on those references because you are no longer reading all of the same things that your parents read and I read and our parents read and our grandparents read. We all read Julius Caesar, and we all read Macbeth, and we all read Hamlet, and we all read Romeo and Juliet, without exception. And probably everyone also, at least in the last 60 years, would have read Catcher in the Rye, and they would have read The Great Gatsby, which we're now catching up on. Right, and things of this nature. So those works become a common vocabulary. So I could make reference to Holden Caulfield and expect that people were going to attach a whole bunch of different ideas and significance to that. Having read Catcher in the Rye, as I could reasonably expect that everyone who graduated from high school had read it. Now, that is, as I said, no longer the case. The Bible still persists, and one thinks will persist as a source of common references, but the number of people who will understand all of the biblical references in a work of literature are, you would think, quite a bit fewer now than there would have been, say, 300 years ago. But I don't actually think that this is necessarily such a problem. I think that it is, when you come across a reference to King Lear in something, which maybe doesn't happen to you super often, but you know that it's a reference to something you're not familiar with, and sometimes that's enough, and sometimes the context can tell you what else you need to know about it. But it remains the case that the more things you read, the more you will get out of other things that you read, right? So it accumulates, right? Your experiences and your familiarity with works allow you to reach new understandings of subsequent works. And Northrop Frye, with his fabulous hair, thought that we could achieve something similar by understanding stories through archetypes. So archetypes of characters, also of story types in general, and also of almost every aspect of setting and all of it. Even actions that happened in the plot could be distilled to a sort of essential archetype. This is perhaps unnecessarily complex, but as I suggested to you earlier, it's certainly valuable to know that one can do that. There are perhaps limited occasions where it is valuable to actually do it, but certainly there are insights that you can gain from doing it. So Booker's 7 essential plots is, Christopher Booker wrote this, and this is your second handout. within the last 20 years, I want to say it came out in like 2004 or 5 or something like that. But it is building off this idea of archetypes, and he has put forward the idea, which, as these things usually are, was somewhat controversial, but is widely talked about and almost widely accepted now, in that there are really only 7 different types of story. And the hero's journey would be one of those 7 types. There are 6 others. And all of our stories that we read or write or see or hear will fall into one of these categories. Now, of course, that seems to be unlikely. How could it be that all stories are really only one of 7 stories? And this is maybe unnecessarily simplistic, but it's helpful. And certainly all stories, we could say, have elements of at least one. That's not to say that they can't be combined. You know, they can be quest and tragedy at the same time, for example. But it's a useful guide, and especially if you are thinking about doing any writing, or if you do any story writing, knowing what sort of thing it is that you're trying to achieve can be useful. And it's kind of one of those instances where it is important that you know the rules before you can determine how best to break them. And this is what I say with grammar and spelling and punctuation. Once you have mastered those rules, then you have permission to break them if you do so with purpose and intention and for some effect, right? But you have to know what you're doing before you can do that. And I would say it may be similar with Booker's 7 essential plots, that if you know those and you're familiar with and comfortable with writing within those, and make no mistake, if you think about the amount of sheer volume of media that's out there for, you know, even just think about television, how many writers must there be that are creating all of that content all the time? There's no shortage of writing jobs. So if you have any gift for this whatsoever, this is the sort of thing that this can give you a solid guideline for how to go about starting a writing career. And obviously, there's much more depth you can get into, and courses you should take for that. But this is a good thing to be familiar with in terms of either thinking about, i.e., criticizing writing, or doing the writing yourself.